If you're preparing for your impending death or your surviving spouse is preparing for your impending death, there are generally 6 things that you want to make sure that you have put in place prior to your passing to make sure that your spouse's financial plan can continue on without interruption. Those 6 things include your emergency savings account. It includes your spouse's maximization strategy of Social Security benefits. It could also include continuation benefits on a pension or annuity plan. You also want to keep in mind the retirement account transfers that may go from your name to his or her name. There are also the housing considerations that you need to keep in mind. And lastly, you also want to make sure that your spouse has a discretionary and essential budget set up to make sure that the expenses that are going to continue on are done so in a way where cash flow stays positive. We also want to make sure that we cover taxes, but that'll be covered in a separate video to go through what a surviving spouse should be aware of when it comes to the tax changes that are going to be taking place as they go from married filing jointly to filing single. Implementing a new plan for a spouse, especially a surviving one, will take some legwork, and it can also be a very emotional topic, but death is an inevitability, and as a result, we need to plan accordingly. If we haven't met yet, my name is Cieniewicz. I'm a CFP professional from Hyperion Financial. The information we cover today is meant to be educational in nature only and is not meant to be taken as any investment or financial planning. And the first thing that we want to make sure that we cover is that our spouse has an adequate emergency fund set up. Generally speaking, there are 3 things that we want to make sure that we have when it comes to an emergency fund. The first 2 maybe are more important than the third one. The first one is that we want to make sure that our emergency fund is safe. We want to make sure that it's secure and it's not subject to unnecessary risk. Now, there's no such thing as a riskless account. There's risk to just about any account that you may hold. But one thing that you can take out is market risk, or the ups and downs that we experience on a daily basis, by keeping your emergency fund in something that is safe. The second thing that we want to make sure that we have is liquidity. So again, just like we would want to make sure that the account is safe, we also want to make sure that it's both liquid and easy to access. By making sure that you have funds that are accessible and easy to use, as well as making sure that it's liquid and that you don't have to worry about going through hoops to access this money, you'll be able to make sure that your spouse can be put in a little bit of ease, knowing that there will be some wiggle room within the plan, and making sure that he or she can access some of these funds without having to experience any types of adverse events. The last thing that you should be looking to maximize is the rate of return. Now, again, you shouldn't necessarily be looking to get rich off your emergency fund, but as interest rates had risen in the past several years, we have also now seen where finally accounts that previously had a lower interest rate now were able to offer some level of return. Again, that includes things like a money market, as well as a savings account. But when it comes to an emergency fund, you want to make sure that you're maximizing your rate of return, but not at the expense of the safety and at the expense of the accessibility and the liquidity of the account. It's inevitable that unexpected costs are going to come up in retirement. And when they do, you want to make sure that you're able to access these funds without disrupting cash flow. A properly funded emergency plan should have a minimum of 6 to 12 months funded inside this account. Positive cash flow is a bedrock for any sound financial plan. No financial plan can survive it that has consistent negative cash flow. As a result, you want to make sure that in the months where you do experience the unexpected, you're able to go to an account that is known where you can find it and it's easy to utilize. Therefore, making sure your emergency fund is properly funded is step 1 to making sure your spouse has a financial plan that can proceed without you. Step 2 is properly understanding Social Security benefits. So depending on how you're currently collecting Social Security benefits, this one could be more applicable to some than others. For example, the individual who has a higher Social Security benefit, if that individual is the one who is going to be the surviving spouse, what you really need to keep in mind is that the spouse who is about to pass is going to also have the Social Security benefit cease. That being the case, you can properly budget and allocate towards that. Now, for spouses who are not the breadwinner or who are collecting on a lower benefit than the spouse who is going to be deceased, what you want to then keep in mind is that you can move forward and collect on the higher benefit of the two, assuming you meet the criteria. If the surviving spouse is full retirement age or older, you're able to receive 100% of the benefit that the deceased spouse was receiving, assuming that that benefit is higher. If the surviving spouse is anywhere between age 60, just prior to their full retirement age, they are eligible to receive a decreased benefit compared to what it would be if they're at their full retirement age, but they are eligible to collect again on the higher benefit of the two. Lastly, what you want to make sure that you have is that you have the death certificate. You also want to make sure that you have a marriage certificate to prove that you are a spouse. And in addition to that, you want to make sure that you do have the social security numbers of both spouses and apply either online, via phone, or at a Social Security office. Another thing to keep in mind are pension and annuity payouts. So depending on the type of pension or annuity that you may have, if you're one of the fortunate ones who has a pension, you probably had an election at the time of your retirement in which you could choose one of several different options. Each pension is different, so across the board, there could be some nuance from pension to pension. But generally speaking, there are a couple of common examples that are readily available to retirees. The first one that you may be familiar with is what's known as the 100% joint and survivor annuity. What that benefit means is it will cover both lives. So for example, if the husband is the one who worked at the job and the spouse, the wife, is the one who did not work at the job, it will cover both of their lives. So if this husband passes away first, the spouse will continue the benefit so long as she's alive. Then if the wife passes away first, the husband will continue to collect on his benefit until he passes. So it's an option that will allow to cover two lives as opposed to one. In addition to that, there could also be options which cover 25% of that benefit, 50% of that benefit, 75% of that benefit. Again, it depends on your specific pension plan if some of those options are available to you. But that could cover a partial benefit in the event that the retired worker is deceased and the surviving spouse is able to collect a portion of that for the rest of his or her life. The other option that's out there is what's known as the single life annuity. The single life annuity will just cover the retired employee's life. So at his or her passing, the spouse will not be able to continue the pension benefit. You need to make sure that you budget for that accordingly. Another option that we see for surviving spouses is what's known as the period certain option. The period certain option can be an interesting one because it may cover one spouse and it may cover another spouse, but only for a certain period. Let's take a quick look at an example. If Stanley Hudson is the working spouse and chooses a 10-year period certain annuity and he's eligible for $2,000 a month, he passes away after 3 years of collecting on the benefit. His wife, Cynthia, will be eligible to receive the benefit for the next 7 years. After that period certain, the benefits will then cease. It really should be obvious that this type of continuation should be planned for because the spouse very well could outlive the period certain. The next thing to keep in mind are retirement account transfers. What we notice with retirement account transfers is there are a number of different retirement accounts that are out there and a number of different ways that you can actually receive the retirement account from a deceased spouse. What we want to keep in mind, though, is that regardless of how we choose this, it's going to depend on a financial situation of which one is best. Knowing that there are so many different options that are out there, the financial situation for the surviving spouse will usually dictate how he or she should continue the benefit, if at all. What we want to first look at, though, is types of accounts that would be considered qualified. So that could be a traditional IRA, a traditional 401k, a 457 plan, a 403b plan. It could also include a Roth IRA. Now, the way that the taxes will work with these are going to be a little bit different, along with what are known as required minimum distributions. The required minimum distributions could actually be an advantage for certain spouses. Let's first cover the two different ways in which an IRA can be received. The first one is what's known as an inherited IRA. With an inherited IRAs, there is what's called the 10-year rule in which you have to then liquidate that account after 10 years. However, if you're a spousal beneficiary and you inherit an IRA and you receive it as such, you are not subject to that 10-year rule. The difference would be if a child would receive it or if a non-spouse beneficiary would receive it who is not otherwise an eligible recipient, that 10-year rule would apply and the recipient would have 10 years to liquidate the account. But for a spouse, An inherited IRA can be received, and there are some reasons why someone may want to consider doing this. One example would be if that spouse is under the age of 59 and a half, and he or she needs access to funds. If he or she is under 59 and a half, they're unable to collect on their own IRA without penalty in most circumstances. Now, with an inherited IRA, you can actually receive some of those funds, which you may owe some of the income tax on in which you receive, specifically if it's a pre-tax IRA. However, you're not subject to that same 10% penalty. As a result of this, it could be a situation where it would be applicable for a surviving spouse who's under 59 and a half to take advantage of some of these funds that can be received without that penalty. The other option is to roll the funds into your own existing IRA. And you would want to do this because you would want to potentially have more control over the RMD rules within this IRA. If you roll it into your IRA and treat that IRA rollover as your own, you have more control over the required minimum distribution dates. This is typically a more common option that folks would choose in the event that they're not consistently taking from the IRA or don't need the money at this time. Again, your financial situation will dictate which is right for you. So you want to make sure that the planning is done ahead of time to understand the pros and the cons of each of these options. The fifth consideration is one that is actually more emotional than the previous ones we talked about, and that's the housing situation. When it comes to financial planning, usually you want to make sure that you are considering both the financial ties to things, the economic side, but also the emotional side. I don't know if I can think of a better example of what a house would be, specifically one that housed both a happy, loving couple to one that will just house one surviving spouse moving forward. As a result, when it comes to housing, there are a couple questions that you should be asking yourself if this is right to continue living in. The first ones are the actual emotional questions that you need to ask yourself. Can you continue to live in this home without the spouse? Is this something that you want to make sure that you have under any circumstances? Again, the emotional side needs to be answered first. Once you're able to clearly identify if you want to continue living in the house or not, you should then be following up with the financial questions. Those 5 financial questions include, number 1, can I afford the mortgage? Number 2, can I afford the insurance and or the property tax? Number 3, can I afford the maintenance costs? Number 4, should I consider moving to a low-cost area? And number 5, should I consider moving closer to family or a caregiver? If you want to continue living in your same home, the first 3 questions should be answered in the affirmative. The next 2 are ones that you may want to be considering if you live in a higher cost area or if you don't have proper help around you who can help provide the help necessary in the event that you would need assistance. This is a life-changing conversation and a life-changing decision, so you shouldn't gloss over it. It should be something that you give a lot of consideration to, but make sure that whatever you decide, you consider the financial implications with that. One other thing worth noting is how the taxes actually work in this situation. The IRS allows for up to $500,000 of a capital gain on the sale of a qualified home to be excluded from reporting. What this means is that you do not need to report any of those capital gains if you meet the following criteria. You need to make sure that the home was used as a primary residence for at least 2 of the last 5 years. This is especially applicable for people who have lived in a home for a very long time and have seen the value of their home continue to rise. Another thing worth noting, though, is that in the event that you do survive a spouse and you maybe need a year or so to decide what your future would hold, you have what's basically amounting to a 2-year extension. If a spouse decides to sell the home and move elsewhere, you could be subject to that same $500,000 capital gain exclusion if you meet the prior criteria we talked about, living in the home for 2 years out of the last 5 as a primary residence. The other 2 criteria that you must meet are that you must not have remarried and you must sell the home within 2 years of your spouse's death. If that's the case, you get to keep that $500,000 exclusion. If not, that drops down to a $250,000 exclusion instead. Making sure that you have a plan for housing, again, while it may be emotional, will have financial impacts to you and will greatly impact your financial plan. The 6th thing to be considering for a surviving spouse are discretionary and essential budget changes. As I mentioned prior in this video, no financial plan can survive if it has consistent negative cash flow, making sure that you have a budget which represents positive cash flow while both spouses are living and at the passing of that spouse is essential. What we oftentimes will hear are that, well, I no longer will have the expenses for two. And that is partially true. But what's good to do is to take inventory of the expenses that will continue, whether it just be one surviving spouse. Those common expenses include the mortgage or the rent, any property tax, home maintenance and improvements, insurance, utilities, and things such as an auto payment or an auto registration. There are other expenses which you should likely notice a decrease in, however, and those include groceries, maybe the phone bill, dining out and entertainment, clothing, and travel. If that's the case, what you want to make sure that you do is that you come up with a budget while both are still alive, and then again, while one is deceased. Making sure that you have a proper cash flow plan will also help with some of the other decisions that we talked about previously, such as your retirement account distributions or your living situation. The other thing to note is that at your passing, you may take up a new hobby, or you may discontinue a hobby that you both did while you were living. Keeping in mind that these hobbies sometimes can cost more than others. You may be able to save money, or you may have to outlay additional dollars, but making sure that you come up with this and planning ahead can really help come up with a plan that will allow you to not have to worry about the finances. If you need help coming up with a plan, my team and I focus on this at Hyperion Financial. We're CFP professionals who help you live your best retirement. And feel free to check out some of the previous videos that we've done related to topics such as this one.